I'm Brian Harward. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Center for Political Participation, and have had the great pleasure of hosting our speaker over the course of the last day, a little more than a day. We've asked a lot of him, and we're certainly very appreciative of all the time he's given to us. Though I was just speaking to Chuck, it seems like his time is winding down, but he's really still in the middle of all his obligations to us. So we look forward to the rest of the afternoon where he's going to come back into the classes over quickly. Before I introduce the student who will then introduce in turn our speaker, I'd like to thank a few people for making this possible. I've already mentioned the athletics department, so thank you. I would also like to specifically thank Sarah Holt, without whose efforts, of course, this day nor the previous day would have happened. Thank you, Sarah. And also Greg Peterson, Allegheny class of 1973, former member of the football team and good friend to the college and certainly to me and the Center for Political Participation. First brought Chuck's work to my attention, having experienced the course and a friendship with Chuck at the Chautauqua Institution. Seemed to me immediately apparent that we ought to bring this person to campus. So thank you, Greg, for making that connection for us and for being here. I've asked Greg to facilitate the Q&A afterwards. And Greg has some prepared questions that I don't think Chuck knows what they are, so we're looking forward to that in particular. But let me start with an introduction of Adam Cohen, first-year student at Allegheny, who will then introduce Professor Chuck Fountain. Adam Cohen took a gap year from between his senior year in high school and his first year at Allegheny to play baseball for the Israel Association of Baseball. He was a two-time national champion of the Premier League, head of statistics, contributor to the reconstruction of the Tel Aviv baseball field, a broadcaster, and a coach. It's a good way to spend a year. His time in Israel led him to the position as the main writer of the New York Yankees for the website backsportspage.com, which allowed him to be a field reporter and interview professional baseball players at Yankee Stadium. Additionally, he's the first broadcaster in Tidewater Summer League's 76-year history, a baseball summer league featuring a variety of college players. Adam is currently a writer for the campus newspaper, a student in the a work study student in the athletic department, and part of Allegheny's baseball data analyst team, and has a radio show on WARC called AJC's Weekly Baseball Talk Show every Saturday from 4 to 6, so please tune in to that. I'm particularly pleased with Adam because he's a student in my FS class on political scandals, and I thought if there's not a better person to introduce the 1919 Black Sox scandal than a student in a political scandal class who has an interest in baseball, it's Adam. So thank you, Adam, for doing this.
I would like to first introduce Professor Charles Fountain. Professor Fountain has had quite an illustrious career. After receiving his bachelor's degree at Boston College and his master's degree at Columbia, his career started taking off around 1973. Over the next 12 years, he worked as a reporter, sports anchor on networks such as WSMW-TV and ABC Radio. In 1985, Fountain's hard work and impressive background led to his appointment at Northeastern University. Professor Fountain's love for journalism effectively manifested in the classroom. Fountain has consistently received high praise from his students and colleagues alike. Besides being a professor at Northeastern, Fountain also served on the editorial board for 6 years, a member of the faculty senate, and has served for over 10 years as the head advisor for the School of Journalism. Furthermore, Fountain's work has been widely published throughout the journalism industry. His works on sports, race, and the history of journalism has appeared in newspapers such as the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, and USA Today. He also remained as a prominent figure on both radio and television. Fountain has made numerous appearances on ESPN's Sports Century series, as well as NPR, PBS, and many other radio and television stations throughout the country. Additionally, Fountain has published 4 books, all of which are critically acclaimed by publications such as the National Review, the Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, and Publisher Weekly, to name a few. His first book, printed in 1984, is titled Another Man's Poison, The Life and Writing of Columnist George Fraser. Fraser was one of the most prestigious jazz critics in America, As a matter of fact, Frazier's sweet and low-down column was a mainstay in the Boston Herald for years to come. After Frazier's tenure as a jazz critic, concluded his career as a respected columnist for the Boston Globe. That being said, it's easy to see why Professor Fountain took an interest in Frazier as a fellow former columnist for the Boston Globe, a significant contributor to American journalism. Fountain's second book is called Sports Writer, The Life and Times of Grantland Rice. Grantland Rice's 50-plus years as a journalist was highlighted as an influential writer in the 1920s, also known as the Golden Age of Sports. Rice revered sports players such as Babe Ruth, Jim Thorpe, and Red Grange, and contributed immensely to their legacies. In his biography, Fountain captures the essence and importance of Rice's immense role in journalism. Fountain's third book is labeled Under the March Sun, The Culture and Commerce of Spring Training. For those who do not know, spring training is the time right before the start of the baseball season. Spring training features underappreciated competition of 60-plus players per team that are given the opportunity to win a spot on the 25 or even the 40-man roster. Fountain specifically referenced the struggles and hardships of professional baseball players, as well as unveiling the economic factors that come to play during spring training. Lastly, Fountain's fourth book, and the one he will be talking about today, is titled The Betrayal, the 1919 World Series and the Birth of Modern Baseball. The 1919 World Series featured the Cincinnati Reds, Chicago White Sox. The White Sox ultimately threw away the World Series for $20,000 apiece, which is much more than their potential World Series winnings earnings. They were infamously dubbed the Black Sox, and would not appear in another World Series for the next 40 years. The investigation of the scandal led to the rise of Hall of Fame Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who dropped a lifetime ban on 8 White Sox players, including would-be Hall of Famers Shoeless Joe Jackson and Eddie Cachette. All 8 players are still banned today, much dismay and anger of their families and friends alike. Professor Fountain, who has made his career on the basis of representing the most prominent moments and figures in American journalism, belongs to the prestigious list of one of the most influential journalists of our time. He has provided a public service to his students and colleagues alike as he pilots the next generation of journalists. Thus, it is my great privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Charles Fountain.
That was pretty thorough. I would have expected nothing less. That I met Adam yesterday and met him again this morning because he came into Brian's office and said, "I'd like to ask you, some questions to, help me plan my summer and jumpstart my career. And, I'd like to pick your brain if I could." So I said, "Absolutely." And drawing on my 40 years of experience and my wealth of contacts throughout the field, I gave him about 30 suggestions, and he nodded politely and said, "Well, I've already done all that." If he is representative, and my sense is that he is, of the Allegheny student body, it makes me wish I kind of went here. So, anyway, I'm going to be talking about something that happened 100 years ago today. But I want to get into it with what I think is one of the most contemporary analogies I can. Are there any fans of the show Succession in here? This is not going to work if there are no fans of the show Succession. No fans of the show Succession? It's the HBO show about a media empire, and the question I was going to ask is, who is the most likable character in that show? And if you've watched the show or are familiar with the reviews that it's been getting, it's in its second season on HBO, you know the answer to that question is nobody is the most likable character. They are all thoroughly reprehensible creatures through the second season, no socially redeeming qualities at all. And that, I think, is kind of a good way to get into the Black Sox story, because it's a story in which there are no heroes. That if you look at the story in its entirety, it touches on virtually every fabric of American life, certainly every fabric of American sports life. And there is, nobody here to root for. The gamblers, the people who corrupted the players, they are probably, the easiest to dismiss. They were the criminals. So nobody likes them. Nobody expected to like them. So we, get rid of them. We weren't expecting them to be the heroes. The players, well, who would, as F. Scott Fitzgerald's Nick Carraway said, who would play with the faith and trust of 50 million people? You know, they betrayed their teammates, they betrayed their fans, so, you know, we can set the baseball players aside. Maybe we can have some understanding for them, but we'll get back to that later. So, you know, but the baseball players were in collusion with the gamblers, so they were the criminals along with the gamblers. So we don't root for the baseball players here, but who's going to protect the integrity of our national game? Who is going to give us, you know, a sense that people can't get away with these kinds of things? Well, we've got, you know, two institutions with a long and rich history of, you know, looking out after American interests, right? And they just so happen to be my profession and Greg Peterson's profession, journalism and the law. Certainly journalism would, you know, bring out and expose, you know, what had happened. And certainly the law would root out and, you know, look after justice in all of these. Well, journalism and the law not only behave badly in this as well, they may be the most dislikable people in the whole darn story. So, but out of all these, you know, cast of villains, if you will, you get an absolutely irresistible story. Not unlike the show Succession, which if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend, where out of this cast of thoroughly dislikable characters and human beings, you get an irresistible show. So, what do we know about the Black Sox story and the Black Sox scandal? Well, despite the fact that we've been poking around in it for 100 years, we know remarkably little for a fact. We know that the Chicago White Sox lost the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds, 5-3. It was a best-of-9 series in those years. And the reason it was a best-of-9 series was that the owners were trying to make up some of the money they lost during the 1919 season. It was unclear whether the 1919 season would even be played, that the 1918 season had been shortened by the war, and even though the war was over in November, it was unclear whether or not the players in the service would be back, whether you know, we would be back on a civilian economy again. So it was unclear whether the 1919 season would be played, unclear whether the fans would embrace the game after the war. So the players decided on a shortened season. They realized halfway through that instead of playing the 154, they were playing 140 games, meant they lost 14 games of gate receipts, and they were trying to make it up. So the World Series that year was a best 5-9, not 4-7. Last time it was ever a best 5-9. We know that Cincinnati won that series 5-3. We know that 8 members of the White Sox had entered into discussions to throw that series to the Cincinnati Reds. We know that at least one of those players had refused to go along. Buck Weaver, the third baseman, was aware of the plot but refused to take any part, accepted no money. We know that the other players got some money. We're not sure how much. We know that some players got $5,000. Eddie Seacott, the starting pitcher in Game 1, got $10,000. We don't know whether or not they actually threw the series or not. The few who spoke afterwards insisted that they were playing their best to win, that they were fed up with the gamblers by the time the series got underway, certainly by the time of the second game, and they were trying to double-cross them and play their best. But, you know, the Cincinnati Reds played better. Cincinnati Reds got terrific pitching across all 8 games and got very timely hitting and may just have beaten the Chicago White Sox, whatever happened in that. So we don't know, you know, to the degree to which the games were actually thrown. We do know that the White Sox lost. Everybody heard rumors during the series that the White Sox were on the take. That baseball heard these rumors, that the press heard these rumors, and one reporter actually tried to report these rumors. And it's very interesting, he didn't try to say the game was under siege. He tried to warn people who were going to bet on the series that there were rumors afoot, that he wanted to protect his readers from losing money. So he put out a warning, ugly rumors about this series suggest not betting. His syndicate refused to publish that précede in his column. And so we heard nothing from the press during the World Series about any of these rumors. And in defense of my industry and in defense of the people who plied my trade well before I did, the rumors accompanying the 1919 World Series were not uncommon. That every World Series to that point had had some measure of rumor. That, this player's on the take, this is not all on the up and up. And they were dismissed by the writers and dismissed by baseball as sort of part of the background noise, part of the white noise of the game. The owners and officials of Major League Baseball likewise dismissed them and sort of shunted them off into the background. And the reason that they all did this was because nobody knew whether or not there were any truth to these rumors, but they also knew that to give a full airing to these rumors was not very good for the game. Rumors of impropriety are not good. You have rumors that the game isn't on the up and up, that's absolutely not good for business, no question about it. But if you suddenly start investigating and prove those rumors to be true, well, that's quite a bit worse for business, isn't it? You can deal with rumors. You can, you can refute them. You can say there's nothing to them. Please don't listen to that. Nothing to see here. Let's just move along. But if you investigate those rumors and prove them to be true, all of a sudden now you're there standing there with your pants down, trying to explain why, your game is this crooked. That was the state of Major League Baseball in 1919. That there had been game fixing, not on the scale of the 1919 World Series, but individual games that if you're betting on a game, you could make just as much betting on a midweek Phillies-Cubs game as you could betting on a World Series if you knew what the outcome of that game was going to be. So gamblers had been reaching players for, the entire history of Major League Baseball, going back to the early days of the 19th century, but very much so since the advent of what we know as organized baseball or Major League Baseball, the merger of the American and National Leagues in 1903, and the beginning of Major League Baseball as we know it today. There had been isolated incidents of game fixing since the beginning of time. And the owners didn't want to hear about it, again, because you prove these all of a sudden now you're in trouble. The whole game is tainted. Can you recover from something like that? So the owners stuck their head in the sand. And the baseball writers, who heard the same rumors, stuck their head in the sand as well, because most of these writers were living very cushy jobs. Having been a sports reporter, I can tell you it's a trip to walk through the press gate, to walk down the steps of a major league ballpark, to walk through the gate, to flash your press badge at the guard, and to walk out onto the field and watch batting practice and talk to the players, to go into the dugout. That's a pretty good life. That's a whole lot better than covering school committee and city council meetings. And if baseball journalism dried up, these reporters would be, all of a sudden hanging around the police station looking for murder stories and covering council meetings and school committee meetings and, a journalism job that, while it is unquestionably essential to the, democracy of our country, is not anywhere near as fun as covering Major League Baseball. So the writers had a self-interest here, that their job, their lifestyle was at stake as well. So the rumors about the 1919 World Series just sort of fluttered in the air and just sort of dissipated like a fog, except that fog kept coming back. Unlike earlier rumors, this fog kept coming back. There were a number of things after the 1919 World Series that kept it alive. One reporter who believed that the series had been fixed wrote about it in December of 1919. His name was Hugh Fullerton. He was a reporter for the Chicago Herald and Examiner, longtime baseball writer, one of the baseball press box royalty. That he wrote about it, and he suggested that the last World Series was not on the up and up. Charles Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox, hired a team of private investigators to go out and follow the players that had been suspected of being in on the fix. And this is a marvelous story of these incompetent private investigators. One guy was trying to trail Happy Felsch in Chicago. Felsch was the center fielder in Milwaukee, Felsch's home. He spent 2 weeks looking at the wrong house. Then somebody told him, and he said, he was reported back, have not seen subject entering or leaving in all my surveillance. And then someone told him he was surveilling the wrong house. And he finally got the right house, and there are Christmas trees involved, and the detective bought a bulk order of Christmas trees, which ingratiated him from Happy Felsch. He was selling them. There were other detectives who were fanning out to different areas following these players. What they found out was that there was no smoking gun here. So Charles Comiskey, who hired these private detectives to find out just what was out there. Is this likely to explode and blow up in our face? And what he concluded was, no, it's not. So he re-signed all of these players to their 1920 contracts, all of the players that were under suspicion. Didn't give any of them a raise, despite their having won the American League pennant going away. But he re-signed them all to their 1920 contracts, and the 1920 season began. The rumors sort of kept, there was a newspaper or a magazine story where somebody purported to be the girlfriend of a ball player and placed bets from him, but it was all pretty thinly sourced and very easy to dismiss. But then in August of 1920, a month left to go in the 1920 season, it all started to unravel. It started in the most innocuous ways. Remember I said you could make as much money betting on a midweek Cubs-Phillies game as on the World Series? Well, William Veck, the father of the Bill Veck who owned the Cleveland Indians and Chicago White Sox in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, William Veck, who was president of the Chicago Cubs, kept getting calls and telegrams on one weekday afternoon. Watch out this afternoon, your team is going to throw the game, there's heavy money being bet on it. The Cubs were in 5th place, the Phillies were in 7th place. The remarkable thing about that is that they were in 5th and 7th instead of 7th and 8th, where they usually were during those years. But, Bill Veck was sufficiently alarmed where he told his manager to pull the starting pitcher, who was, believed to be the one who might be compromised here. And the Cubs lost the game anyway, but Bill Veck was distressed by all of this. And he went to the baseball writers of Chicago and said, look into this, please, that these rumors are hurting the game. We can't let these rumors to continue to hurt the game. I want you to look into this. Now, why he went to the writers instead of the district attorney, I'm not entirely sure. But, he probably understood that there's advantages to having, friends who buy ink by the barrel. So he went to the baseball writers and said, please investigate this. And the baseball writers said, why are we investigating this? This isn't our job. Let's bring it to the grand jury. Well, the grand jury was under the direction of a brand new judge, recently elected, had been sworn in only 7 days before. This is now early September 1920. The judge's name was Charles McDonald. He didn't want to be a judge in Chicago. He wanted to be the next commissioner of baseball. And his good friend Ban Johnson, who was president of the American League, wanted him to be the next commissioner of baseball. So Charles McDonald, when the writers started saying the grand jury should look into this, went to Ban Johnson and said, is this good for my chances of getting this baseball job? And Ban Johnson said, oh yes, it is. Please do it. So Charles McDonald agreed to look into the allegations that that Cubs-Phillies game was under suspicion. The writers then said, well, as long as they're looking into gambling in that Cubs-Phillies game, why don't they look into these rumors that the 1919 series was fixed? Charles McDonald calls up Ban Johnson. Would looking into these rumors enhance my chances of being the next commissioner of the game? Ban Johnson said, oh yes, it would. Now the grand jury is looking into allegations of 1919 World Series game fixing. they began hearing testimony from witnesses, and nothing new came out, all the same old rumors, everything was secondhand. There was, a lot of noise, but not much substance to any of it. Following this from afar was one of the would-be fixers, a guy named Billy Mahard, who was an amateur prize fighter, who was one of the second-string fixers. There were tiers of fixers in 1919. There were actually 3 groups of gamblers talking to the ball players at different times. And, some of them had loose connections to one another. But Billy Mahard was one of these guys. He was a particularly inept fixer because he didn't know that the White Sox were playing Game 3 to win, and he bet all the money that he had made on Games 1 and 2 on the Reds to win Game 3, and when they lost, he was broke and he had to go home. So he was mad at these players. And he was reading these stories and, saying, they don't have the half of the story. I know a lot more about this. And he went to a friend on a Philadelphia newspaper and said, I know something about this. And the editor of that paper, which is the Philadelphia North American, told his baseball writer, look into this. Let's see what we want to do with this. Now, when you had somebody coming forward with the explosive story that I have firsthand knowledge of the 1919 World Series, and it was indeed fixed, that, what you wanted the reporter to look into was whether or not we should play this big on the front page or whether we should downplay it and put it, on the sports page. And, it went on the front page. And when that story ran, which was late September 1920, the lid was blown off the whole story. That finally there was someone who wasn't offering much that hadn't been put forth before, but he claimed to have inside first-person knowledge. This was a first-person story. That was going to be more difficult to ignore. It was going to mean that all of the players that were under suspicion were now going to be called before the grand jury. So Charles Comiskey met that next morning, the morning the article came out, with his attorney, a man named Alfred Austrian. And they said, well, if this is going to blow up, we've got to be the guys that blow it up. We can't be taken down with this. In other words, Comiskey signed those players after investigating them because he wanted to keep his championship team intact. Now it was no longer possible to keep his championship team intact. He just wanted to retain control of the team, which he did by offering up ultimately 3 of the players to the grand jury. The first guy he called in was the pitcher Eddie Seacott, who had won 35 games in 1919 with a 1.82 earned run average or something, and was the key to the whole thing, and also wore the burden of his shame heavier than anybody else. That in the Alfred Austrian's office that morning, the Alfred Austrian, Charles Comiskey, the owner, Kid Gleason, the manager of the White Sox, Harry Graebner, who was Comiskey's right-hand man, were there talking about, all right, how do we handle this? How do we, manage this so that we're the good guys here? And Alfred Austrian asked, which of these guys is most likely to tell the truth? And Kid Gleason, the manager, said, Eddie Seacott. He had watched Eddie Seacott throughout the summer grow more and more withdrawn, usually a gregarious person, had drawn more and more withdrawn, more and more insular, separating himself from his teammates. And, whenever Gleason tried to talk to him, it was a difficult conversation. So he felt that Seacott would be, the easiest one to crack or the most likely to come clean. So they sent for Eddie Seacott and they brought him into the office, and Seacott did indeed come clean. They assured him, Alfred Austrian assured him, it's not you we're after, it's the gamblers. We want you only as a witness. We're not going to prosecute you. You're going to be able to go home tonight. Trust me on this. And Seacott did. He went to the grand jury. The first thing they gave him was an immunity waiver that said, I am making these statements of my own free will with no preconditions, and I understand that anything I say may be used against me in future criminal proceedings, and he signed that happily. With Alfred Austrian's words in his ear, we don't want you, we want the gamblers. The next person, while Seacott was confessing, they brought in Joe Jackson. Joe Jackson is the mythic center of this whole story. He's the guy who keeps the story alive, even at this, far remove. Joe Jackson had spent the morning drinking. Everybody was aware of this Philadelphia story, and everybody knew that something was going to happen here. And Joe Jackson spent the morning drinking, and he later testified that he was probably half drunk when he got to Alfred Austrian's office about noon. Joe Jackson, the illiterate, uneducated, rube was his reputation, was no dope that he came in and he said, I think I would like to have my own attorney. And Alfred Austrian said, you don't need an attorney. We can do you far more good than any attorney can. This is a question for an ethics class in law school maybe, said, well, maybe I'll go out and get an attorney. Well, no attorney would come to my office. Then I'll get one from your own firm to come in here and represent me. Know that we can do you more good than any attorney. Trust me on this. So Joe Jackson then confessed after they told him that we had the goods on you. Confessed in Austrian's office, was brought up to the criminal courts building, confessed before the grand jury there. When he left, by this time the criminal courts building, the word had spread throughout the city that White Sox players were confessing. So there were crowds, throngs of people crowding the criminal courts building on West Hubbard Street. And when one of those people was Hugh Fullerton, the Herald and Examiner writer who had tried to break the story back in December, and for his troubles, by the way, was thoroughly excoriated and criticized by the baseball press. That editorials in the Sporting News and in the baseball magazine after Fullerton's article in December said that, here's a guy that doesn't know what's going on. If he thinks a baseball game can be fixed, he doesn't know anything about the game. That baseball is impossible. The baseball press rallied to the defense of baseball, not to their colleague in the press box. So Hugh Fullerton is outside the criminal courts building when Joe Jackson emerges. And Hugh Fullerton records a scene on the courthouse steps which has endured for a century, will endure for another century more, as long as we're discussing the Black Sox scandal, which I suspect will be as long as baseball is being played. And baseball will be played for a long time because the games will ultimately last about 19 days. We're up to 4 hours now and gaining. So anyway, one game will be the last game because it'll never end. It'll be the bottom of the eighth for 15 years. 6,500 pitching changes. Hugh Fullerton records the scene as Joe Jackson coming out of the criminal courts building, a throng of people on the steps, and one little urchin, as Fullerton describes him, stepping out from the crowd and saying, "It ain't true, is it, Joe?" And Jackson replying, "Yes, son, I'm afraid it is." And the little urchin replying, "Well, I never would have thought it." Those three lines have encapsulated the Chicago Black Sox story for 100 years. That "it ain't true, is it, Joe?" has morphed into "say it ain't so, Joe," which is a phrase that has entered the American language. There's been a lot of debate about whether or not that ever happened. Did Fullerton make it up? There was no other reporter that heard it. That's a pretty strong argument. There were reporters all over the place that day that no other reporter, and believe me, any reporter that heard that would have printed it. There were no other reporters that heard it, no other reporters that published it. There's the evidence right there. It was also a crowded scene. It's possible that Fullerton was in exactly the right place to hear what was, an exchange that lasted no more than 7 or 8 seconds, 3 sentences. He might have gotten it. But my position on it is I don't care whether Hugh Fullerton got it and nobody else did, or whether Hugh Fullerton made it up. He nailed it. Look at what's there. Look at what's there in 3 sentences. "It ain't true, is it, Joe?" "Yes, son, I'm afraid it is." "Well, I never would have thought it." You've got a Shakespearean tragedy in miniature. You've got the little boy stepping in for the whole country, feeling that sense of hurt even though he's a little more perplexed than hurt. But still, the sense of betrayal that I never would have thought it. You've got Joe Jackson, the biggest sports hero America had at that moment, perhaps, brought down, standing there in his shame. "Yes, son, I'm afraid it is," he says sheepishly. It's the whole story right there, 3 sentences. Why it has seized our imagination for the last 100 years. Players were all indicted, and now here the story gets really great. The reporters are playing catch up on this. The reporters who had heard these rumors and didn't, report any of them for 12 months are now, in their righteous indignation, writing as loudly as they possibly can about how there is no place for these players outside of a penitentiary. And, the players were in keeping with, the management of baseball who wanted these players, let off in shackles to Joliet. The lawyers are now the ones who enter into this. This was never about justice, that the players were not charged with fixing a baseball game. There was no law against fixing a baseball game in 1919. They were arraigned on a whole array of arcane charges, that the most comprehensible of which was conspiracy to injure the business of their boss. There was, a little trouble for the average citizen to get their arms around these kinds of concepts. But there was some question as to whether or not the trial would ever happen, because all of those confessions and immunity waivers, they showed up missing. That in between the time they were made in the fall of 1920 and the scheduled start of the criminal trial, which was scheduled for March of 1921, the confessions and the immunity waivers went missing. The attorney for Arnold Rothstein, who was the gangster gambler whose money bankrolled this, and Arnold Rothstein would be another hour that we could spend talking on him alone. But basically, here was a guy who carried $100,000 in cash on him when he walked around Manhattan. And the best estimate is that he fixed the World Series with $80,000. So think about that for a minute. Arnold Rothstein engineered the greatest scandal in American sports history with what he had on him. Arnold Rothstein was fearful of being indicted. He insisted that he testify before the grand jury. Didn't look like he was going to be indicted, but he didn't want to leave anything to chance. He wanted this whole thing to go away. So he commissioned his lawyer, a guy by the name of Bill Fallon. It was Bill Fallon about whom the old joke, he's a criminal lawyer, isn't he? Yes, very. It was said that Bill Fallon was the first person about whom that was said. He was the consummate jury fixer, the consummate courtroom pleader. He was a brilliant attorney who cheated, the jailer out of hundreds of guilty people through all sorts of, means. And he was going to see that his client, Arnold Rothstein, wasn't, hung up in this big scandal. So he sent his partner, a guy who shared his ethics, to Chicago with $10,000 of Arnold Rothstein's money. That money made its way to the first assistant to the state's attorney, and all of a sudden the confessions and the immunity waivers are missing. All sorts of pleadings and hearings about whether or not the copies of these could be admitted. They were finally admitted in July of 1921, after a delay of 4 months. The players finally went to trial. They were quickly acquitted. That the last arguments were finished at about 8 o'clock at night. The judge went off to have dinner. The jury went to deliberate, and in about 40 minutes they returned the verdict. They had to wait for the judge to get back from dinner, and the players were all quickly acquitted. They were carried out of the courtroom on the shoulders of the spectators, who were all baseball fans, and celebrating their acquittal and looking forward when they would be back in the White Sox lineup the next day. But the next day, instead of being back in the White Sox lineup, came the directive from Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the brand new commissioner of baseball, which is another hour conversation that we can have next time I'm here, about how Kennesaw Landis was brought into the game. But Kennesaw Landis was a Chicago federal judge, and he had been persuaded by the owners in the summer and fall of 1920 to come in as commissioner of baseball. That, you know, it wasn't so much that the owners wanted a strong figure to clean up the game. They wanted to push Ban Johnson, who was the de facto ruler of the game, the American League president, and Charles Comiskey's bitter enemy. They wanted to push him out of the position of influence and power that he had. So they persuaded Landis, who is perhaps the country's best known jurist, and I mentioned this last night for those of you who were at the Ida Tarbell talk. He was best known for having levied a fine in 1907 on John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. John D. Rockefeller, of course, was brought down by Ida Tarbell's writing. I love it when all of these things come together. He had levied a $29 million fine on John D. Rockefeller, which Rockefeller said Landis will be dead a long time before that fine is paid. And Rockefeller was right that the fine was overturned, but Landis was famous. That Rockefeller is not a very popular figure, and you know, in the minds of the public, the appeals court had made the mistake, not Landis, in all of this. So he was riding that reputation as the protector of the little guy into his job as commissioner. And the morning after the players were acquitted, he made his first public comment, really, on the scandal. He had been in office for about 7 months, but he had not said anything about the biggest story hanging over baseball. But on the morning after the acquittal, he issued a ruling that said, regardless of the verdicts of juries, said this former federal judge, regardless of the verdicts of juries, no ball player who conspires to throw a baseball game or who sits in conference where the ways and means of throwing a baseball game are discussed and does not immediately report it, will ever play baseball again. And the careers of the 8 players who were caught up in this, pitchers Eddie Seacott, lefty Williams, first baseman Chick Gandil, shortstop Swede Risberg, outfielders Happy Felsch and Shoeless Joe Jackson, and utility man Fred McMullen, and the very innocent but possessed of guilty knowledge third baseman Buck Weaver were all severed from the game at that moment in July of 1921. And it would seem that that would have brought an end to the story. But in truth, insofar as our fascination is concerned, it was just the very beginning. That we've been discussing it now for 100 years, and we'll continue to discuss it because it has everything we want in a story. Absent somebody to root for, maybe. It's got everything we want in a story. It's got moral undertones. What happened here? How could they have done this? How could they have done this to us? That baseball America, all of baseball, felt personally wounded by what had happened. This was personal, and it's still personal. It's when you read about it long after the fact, you say, how could they have done this? You say, well, my team could have never done this. The Red Sox, in my case, the Tigers, in Greg's case, we could have never done this because, we fervently believe that the athletes that we root for represent all that is noble and to be applauded in this world. And searching for the answer as to why, continuing to feel the hurt, not having any clear answers. This is not only baseball's timeless morality play, it's baseball's eternal mystery. So we keep scratching at it. People keep writing at it, keep thinking, well, the key documents are somehow going to turn up. The letters from the papers of Charles Comiskey are going to turn up somewhere. They haven't, they're not likely to. Somehow we're all going to have clarity to this at some moment. And the fact that we all know that we never will enhances our fascination with this story. And I suspect will continue to enhance our fascination with this story. I suspect that I am certain of relatively few things in this world, but I am dead certain that mine will not be the last book on the Black Sox story. So, I want to thank everybody for coming. You know, it's flattering to have so many people in this room, to have so many students in this room, to have the athletic department at Allegheny here. And I am touched and honored by your presence. I would like to invite my friend Greg Peterson, the person who is you know, responsible for bringing me here. I don't know what it is, but Greg has got something over Brian that you know, has allowed him to bring me here today. So Greg, I know, has got something prepared.
I don't know if I have anything prepared, but a little bit of serendipity. I'm an Allegheny. I'm an Allegheny grad, 1973. Played football with the likes of John Chucker and Sam Time. We have to go move back a lot of pages to find when they were coaching here. But nevertheless, just a thrill for me to have Chuck brought back to my alma mater, my wife's alma mater. And in a little bit of serendipity, a few months ago, I was watching and typing in on an auction site. It's an auction site, and I typed in Black Sox, 1919 Black Sox, and up popped something really unique. And I bid on it, and hoping against hope that I would actually win it, to show Chuck today, specifically today, right before you. And hopefully he'll be able to comment, because he talked about the personalities, the players, and that there were probably no heroes in this. But I want to ask him if there were, in fact, once he looks at this in this list of what is, this is a team sheet, a 1919 Chicago White Sox team sheet. And what that means is the actual autographs, this has been certified, of all the players of the Black Sox. Kind of a cool piece of memorabilia. So Chuck, with that, I'm just going to show it to you. You don't have it. I'm not giving it to you, but you can show. You can show, because there may be a hero in all of that mix of autographs. But the most important one is right there near the bottom.
Yep. Joe Jackson, who was illiterate but did know how to sign his name. He did not do it often, but there are Joe Jackson autographs around. There were 18 players on the White Sox in 1919. That was a full major league roster, also cut down from previous years in an attempt for owners to save money. 7 of them were involved, 8 of them had guilty knowledge, which meant there were 10 players on the team that became known as the Clean Sox. They included Hall of Famer Eddie Collins and Hall of Famer Ray Schalk. They included the rest of the starting lineup and an heroic rookie pitcher by the name of Dickie Kerr, who won 2 games for the White Sox during that series. In large part, the Clean Sox were hard to root for in this as well. That there were frictions on the team, that there was a schism on the team, and the players that became the Black Sox were ostracized from the Eddie Collins clique. Eddie Collins was a Columbia graduate. He was the highest paid player on the team. He was a future Hall of Famer. He was a certified star. He was also aloof. That he might have been the guy who brought that team together and didn't. I don't know where I stand on Eddie Collins in this whole story. Ray Schalk might be a person to root for. That of all the people in the White Sox that you feel badly for, the manager Kid Gleason, I think, is the one that jumps to mind. That he was a baseball lifer. He was a favorite of Ring Lardner, the immortal short story writer who wrote baseball during this era, and understood the centrality that Gleason had on this team. He had been a coach for 7 years. 1919 was his first year as manager. He's the sort of quintessential baseball lifer that we all know and somehow identify with. And he felt the sense of this betrayal more than I think anybody else did, and was wounded by it more than anybody else did. that, root for him. Could he have kept it together? I think he kept it together as well as he was able. That I looked at Eddie Collins as a guy who could have been a, more critical catalyst in this. But this is, this is a remarkable document. So, I'm going to give it back to you before I drop it. Van Johnson was not only the president of the American League and the most powerful single figure in the game at that point, because he sort of imposed his will on his fellow members of the National Commission, but he was also the bitter enemy of Charles Comiskey. And this whole bringing Judge Landis into the story was less a part of cleaning up the game than it was a power struggle between Charles Comiskey and Van Johnson. When the state's attorney's case was falling apart, when the witnesses were balking, when the confessions and immunity waivers were stolen, and it looked as though the case was going to fall apart and never come to trial. Van Johnson put the full financial resources of the American League at the disposal of the state's attorney in Cook County. And Van Johnson actually led the investigation. He went personally to Texas to interview a guy who had been one of the purported fixers. That guy had become the star witness in the trial a summer later. That that were it not for Van Johnson in all of this, that there may not have even been a trial. What happened to him was that he was marginalized. He remained president of the American League, remained very bitter about this. And if Judge Landis had issued a decree saying that the baseballs were white, Van Johnson would have called up the reporters and said, this shows that Landis doesn't know anything about baseball. Everyone knows baseballs are black. That anything Landis said, Johnson said the opposite, which increasingly marginalized him. And in 1927, the American League owners were finally fed up and forced him out as president, and he continued for the last 4 or 5 years of his life to write as told to articles with friendly reporters trying to get his reputation back, which to a certain degree he did because he was one of the early members of the Baseball Hall of Fame.
So the White Sox then became in 1920, how did they make out? The season ended in September of 1920 for the team. Many of them obviously were banned. How did the 21 team do? Did they ever kind of really come back?
Yeah, in 1959. When the players confessed before the grand jury in late September, the White Sox were 2 games out of first place with about 5 games to play. They were still very much in it. They did not, win, which sort of spared baseball a tremendous embarrassment. In 1921, without those 7 players, they tumbled into the second division, where they stayed throughout, literally the next 3 decades. They were not a competitive team again, literally until the late 1950s, when Bill Veck bought the franchise from the Comiskey family.
Any seeds to the fact that the 1919 Black Sox were paid sub-marginally by Comiskey, which in fact was preyed upon by the Goldstein and others, Rothstein rather, Arnold Rothstein. So they became fair game to actually enhance their financial gains.
That's one of the myths of the story, and we owe that myth to Elliot Hasson, who is the author of 8 Men Out, which was the first really impactful story of the Black Sox. It was published in the early 60s. It is much richer in its detail and its storytelling than my book, because Elliot Hasson was unencumbered by fact. That whenever he hit a roadblock in the story, which is virtually at every turn, he made something up. And one of the things he made up, or 2 of the things he made up, was that Eddie Seacott got involved because he was denied a bonus for winning 30 games because Comiskey kept him out of the lineup. Did not happen, and all anybody needs to do is look at the litany of games. Seacott took his regular turn, in that season. The other one was that the White Sox were, much more poorly paid than any other team, which is also not true. They were paid exactly the way other teams were paid. That every owner in the game paid his players as little as possible, and that included Charles Comiskey. That the White Sox were no more or less poorly paid than anybody else.
Given the time constraints, I'm going to have one of the last questions be offered up by the introducer.
So you mentioned that like the White Sox roster in like 1920 was only 18 players, and that 7 of them were guilty, and 1 of them had knowledge and was guilty by comparison, according to chemist Landis. So there are only 10 players. So like, who are those 8 new players that joined the White Sox the following year? Or did they just play with like 10 players or so for the entire season?
They were the people who came into the roster were the 8 best players in whatever they didn't have affiliate teams there, but whatever the 8 best contracts the White Sox could buy up from minor league teams at those years. There was nobody who came into the White Sox as a result of an opening made possible by the suspension of the players who went on to an illustrious and storied career. The best players on the White Sox remained Eddie Collins and Ray Schalk and St. Shano Collins and the people who had been the Clean Sox in 1919.
Our time has come to an end. I know many of you have classes that you must make, but let's take a moment now to express our gratitude to Professor Fallon for coming.
Thank you very much.